Deep Dive Podcast by the Boca Raton Tribune.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We are jumping straight into, well, a really significant piece of source material today. It's the report covering Donald Trump's address to the 80th UN General Assembly back on September 23rd, 2025.
And it's significant for a reason. This wasn't your standard diplomatic boilerplate.
No, definitely not. If you were expecting that, you'd be mistaken. The sources are pretty unanimous. They call this 56-minute speech combative, wide-ranging, even a scathing rebuke to the UN itself.
Right.
So our mission today really is to get past just the headlines. We want to extract the core arguments, look at the specific policy demands he laid out, and, the very charged language he used. It really defines this moment.
Absolutely. And the context here is crucial. We have to remember this was seen as a clear return to form. Trump, during his first term, was often a very vocal critic of the UN. So the leaders in that room, they knew what might be coming. And the sources note that he received only polite applause when he left. Well, that says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does. Polite applause. It just screams diplomatic tension, maybe even some quiet calculation happening there.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this, because the speech seems to have revolved around two huge themes, almost intertwined, wouldn't you say? Migration and climate policy.
Definitely the dominant focus.
Let's start with migration. He clearly used the UN stage to push hard for lower global migration levels, and he basically held up his own U.S. policies as, well, a model for everyone else.
He did, and not subtly either. The source quotes him directly saying, "I'm really good at this stuff."
Right, followed immediately by that assessment of the other nations present.
Ah, yes. The line, "Your countries are going to hell," delivered right there to the heads of state. It's quite something.
It is. And how did he connect that to, say, Western Europe specifically?
Well, that's where it gets particularly interesting from a policy perspective. He explicitly warned them, the source says, immigration and their suicidal energy ideas will be the death of Western Europe.
Suicidal energy ideas. So he's linking energy policy directly to their ability to handle migration.
Precisely. The argument presented is that high-cost, anti-fossil fuel energy policies, these suicidal ideas, weaken European economies. They weaken the infrastructure.
Okay.
And that makes them unable, in his view, to manage migration flows, which then leads towards, well, collapse. It connects economic strategy, energy, and social stability all into one rather dire prediction.
That's a complex link he's drawing, energy poverty leading to a migration crisis as a single point of failure.
Yes.
But it's important, like the sources point out, to remember the counterargument. Human rights advocates are quoted saying these are people seeking safety, seeking better lives, not agents of collapse.
Of course. The sources do provide that vital context.
And that mention of suicidal energy ideas takes us right into the second big theme, climate and energy policy. This was just a week after he met King Charles in Britain, who's known for his environmental focus.
Yet, it seems that meeting didn't moderate his stance much, if at all, by the time he got to the UN podium.
Apparently not. He didn't just question climate actions. The reports say he called climate change itself a con job.
He did, and urged nations globally to pretty much abandon renewable energy goals and really double down on fossil fuels.
Which is a direct challenge to, well, most international agreements and the scientific consensus.
It absolutely is. And the source material is careful to include that brief counterpoint. Most scientists say climate change caused by humans is real.
Right.
So the takeaway for you, listening, is just how stark this policy difference is. He wasn't looking for middle ground on global climate goals. He used the UN platform to essentially reject the entire premise behind them.
A demand for a complete global U-turn based on his domestic agenda.
You could certainly frame it that way, yes.
Okay, now this is where, for me, it gets really interesting. Let's shift to the foreign policy friction points, specifically Ukraine and NATO, because allies had been trying to stabilize things, ensure support for Kyiv continued.
And despite those efforts, he delivered some incredibly sharp criticism.
He mocked NATO allies, didn't he, for buying Russian energy?
He did, quite openly,
Yeah.
accusing them, essentially.
Yeah.
He said, they're funding the war against themselves. Who the hell ever heard of that one?
Yeah.
It's a very transactional view of alliances, isn't it?
Incredibly blunt. But the critical part here, the thing we really need to focus on, is the conditionality he attached to any U.S. action against Moscow. He mentioned strong tariffs.
Yes, a very strong round of powerful tariffs was the phrase used. The U.S. was ready to impose these to pressure Russia.
Yeah.
But and this is the unprecedented part,
Okay.
he made it absolutely clear that for those U.S. tariffs to work, European nations would have to join us in adopting the exact same measures.
Wow. The exact same measures, not just similar goals, but identical policy.
That's what the source indicates. It's not consultation, it's conditional, it's enforced economic alignment, you could say.
That just raises massive questions, doesn't it? About market impacts, about sovereignty. I mean, is the U.S. threatening global economic disruption if allies don't fall perfectly in line?
It's the essence of transactional diplomacy, pushed perhaps further than we've seen it before. It's based on compulsion.
And did he name specific countries he was targeting with that energy comment?
Yes, the sources identify Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey as the main European buyers. He seemed to be focusing on nations, with sometimes complicated relationships within NATO anyway.
Right.
And it wasn't just Europe. He also apparently mentioned considering sanctions against big players like India and China if they keep doing business with Russia.
So the message was, U.S. economic pressure only works if everyone globally gets on board with the U.S. plan. Or else
the U.S. measures presumably wouldn't be implemented or wouldn't be effective. The success was presented as entirely conditional on universal compliance.
That said, diplomacy wasn't totally dead in the water, was it? The source mentions a planned meeting with President Zelenskiy.
That's right. Later that same day, he was scheduled to meet with the Ukrainian president to discuss U.S. support. So even amidst all that confrontational rhetoric, the door for some kind of tactical negotiation maybe was still open.
Okay, now let's pivot again. The Middle East. The Israel-Palestinian conflict. He took a stance against the idea of a Palestinian state, which many world leaders had been moving towards embracing.
Yes, he rejected that push. And the justification reported was very direct.
What was the reasoning given?
That the rewards associated with establishing a Palestinian state right now would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities, essentially arguing it would validate their actions.
That's a tough line. But it wasn't just rejection, was it? There was also a call for action.
Correct. It's complex. At the same time, he called for an immediate ceasefire for hostages deal, the goal being the return of all hostages, living and deceased.
And then peace negotiations.
Yes, followed by the need to immediately negotiate peace. So it seems like a strategy of maybe maximum pressure on the long-term political question, combined with an urgent push for a short-term security deal.
Hard line on statehood, urgent on hostages, and a ceasefire.
That seems to be the tension, yes. And we know from the sources he had talks planned later that day with Gulf leaders about Gaza's future. So high-level discussions were still happening even as he was setting down these very firm markers at the UN.
Okay, but before we wrap up with the big takeaways, the sources highlight something almost bizarre. After these huge global policy pronouncements, he narrows the focus right down to, well, personal complaints about the UN building itself. Why include that?
It is fascinating, isn't it? Rhetorically, it seems to illustrate a kind of contempt, not just for UN policies, but for the very institution, its physical infrastructure, its basic functioning.
So it wasn't just policy disagreement.
No. He complained the UN hadn't supported his past peacemaking efforts. That's policy. But then it got really specific and personal.
The escalator incident.
Yes, the source details that. A malfunctioning UN escalator where Melania Trump apparently nearly fell when it stopped suddenly.
And the teleprompter.
And a faulty teleprompter during his own speech, which for a 56-minute address would be quite annoying, I imagine.
So it all leads to that quote.
Right. He reportedly summarized his whole UN visit experience by saying, "These are the two things I got from the United Nations, a bad escalator and a bad teleprompter."
It's almost using these minor inconveniences as a metaphor for the whole system being broken in his eyes.
Exactly. It serves to diminish the entire institution down to these tangible, frustrating failures. It's a powerful, if unusual, rhetorical move.
So if we synthesize all this, stepping back from the deep dive, the core message from that speech seems to be dominated by these non-negotiable domestic priorities, pushed globally anti-migration, anti-climate action, coupled with these very conditional economic threats regarding Russia, and then that really hard line on the Middle East two-state solution.
I think that's a fair summary. And what the source material really throws into relief is this fundamental clash. You have domestic policy priorities being presented almost as mandatory global blueprints.
Right.
And that's clashing directly with the whole spirit of multilateral diplomacy, which the UN is supposed to embody, consensus-building negotiation.
Instead, it was confrontation.
Overwhelmingly confrontation, conditionality, and as we saw with the escalator comments, almost a sort of cheerful disdain for the institution itself.
So a final thought maybe for our listeners to mull over.
Well, I think something to really consider is, what are the long-term implications when global negotiation starts to hinge less on diplomacy or shared values and more on, well, the explicit threat of unilateral economic action, like these powerful tariffs being imposed on allies if they don't comply perfectly?
What happens to the idea of an alliance then?
Exactly. What does alliance even mean when cooperation isn't freely chosen, but seems to be fundamentally forced? It's a big question.
A very big question, especially when we're talking about things as fundamental as global trade and energy. Definitely something to keep thinking about. That's all the time we have for this deep dive into the sources. We really encourage you to keep exploring these complex global tensions.